So now we'll start the third panel about the Republic of Singapore. The lecturer is Dr. Tim Huxley, that is officer of the Order of the British Empire, despite the British Empire no longer exists. He's a doctor, he holds a PhD in international relations, and he's the former director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and the chapter of Asia. If you don't know the International Institute for Strategic Studies, maybe you know the Military Balance, that it's a publication that yearly gives all the data that you need about armed forces around the world. Any data that you need is in that publication. But anyway, that institution has a wide range of activity about defense policy, international relations, and strategy. And last and not least, I think that one of the most important things to remark is that Dr. Huxley is the author of this book, that for me is the book about the Singapore defense policy, Defending the Lion City. It's a book that has about 20 years, but despite that, it's quoted in a lot of papers about the Singapore Armed Forces. So, if you want to know more, that's the book. So, without more preliminaries, Dr. Huxley, the floor is yours.
And also for inviting me to speak at this supremely interesting conference, which I'm enjoying very much, with two good sessions this morning. So I'm going to talk about Singapore as a maritime state, a security and defense perspective. To start with, I'm going to talk briefly about Singapore's history, including its colonial history and its history during the immediate pre-independence and post-independence stages, because I think that's important because it provides the context for how Singapore has developed over the last 50 or 60 years, including in the defense sphere, because it's the pre-independence phase and the phase immediately after independence which have shaped how Singaporeans, and particularly Singapore's political leadership, thinks about their strategic interests and how to defend them. So Singapore's early history is quite vague, and there are archaeologists digging up parts of Singapore all the time, trying to uncover what happened in the past. But as far as we know, there was a port and settlement called Temasek on Singapore in the 14th century, and it was probably at various times a vassal of much larger regional powers like Majapahit and Siam. At the end of the 14th century, it seems that Singapore was largely abandoned. There was just a small trading settlement there until the early 17th century, when the Portuguese, dominant regional power at the time, destroyed it. And from the 16th to the 19th centuries, European powers incrementally took control of maritime Southeast Asia. So sequentially, the Portuguese and the Dutch and then the British. In 1819, just over 200 years ago, Sir Stamford Raffles, who was the governor of the British colony of Bencoolen on the island of Sumatra, now part of Indonesia, sent an expedition to Singapore, and by then Singapore was nominally ruled by the local Malay Sultanate of Johor. Raffles' aim in sending an expedition to Singapore was to set up a new port on the trade route between China and British India, which would allow British merchant ships to avoid Dutch ports in the region because they would be heavily taxed in Dutch ports. So this was to make British trade activities in the region smoother and more economically viable. And the British then gradually strengthened their control over Singapore and exerted considerable pressure on the local Malay rulers who ceded Singapore to the British East India Company 200 years ago in 1824. And the British also encouraged immigration into Singapore from China and India to provide a labor force. Raffles himself didn't stay very long in Singapore, but he did, very importantly, set up a framework of law, order, and probity, which has underlain the subsequent economic success of the island. And even today, in a region which is often violent, anarchic, and corrupt, Singapore stands out quite distinctly from what's going on in the rest of the region. Under colonial rule in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Singapore became an important entrepot in the region. It also became a bastion of British power in Southeast Asia. And during the 1920s and 30s, Britain built a major naval base in Singapore. Churchill referred to that as the Gibraltar of the East. But the fact is that in the 1930s, Britain severely underestimated the challenge that Japan posed to its own role in Asia and to the role of other European powers, the Dutch and the French. And Britain lacked sufficient military resources to defend Malaya and Singapore in 1941 and 1942 from the Japanese invasion forces. And Singapore was occupied by Japan from February 1942 onwards. It was occupied brutally for 3.5 years, and during that time, the majority community on the island, the ethnic Chinese community, suffered particularly badly. And from the first days of the Japanese occupation, there were large-scale reprisals against the Chinese population, and famously, in the first week of the occupation, hundreds, if not thousands, of young Chinese men were machine-gunned on the beaches of Singapore. And this was a reprisal because the local ethnic Chinese community had provided substantial funds in support of Republican China's efforts to resist Japanese occupation over the previous several years. After Japan surrendered in 1945, the UK quickly reoccupied Singapore and its other colonies in Southeast Asia. But it was clear then that the myth of colonial superiority had been broken by the Japanese occupation, which showed to Asians that colonial powers were not invincible. Okay, so here's Lee Kuan Yew, who was a significant figure in independent Singapore's evolution. The background to his rise to power is this. From the late 1940s and into the 50s, colonial rule in Malaya and Singapore were challenged by the Malayan Communist Party. And that was mainly supported by a minority within the ethnic Chinese community. And it had backing, of course, from the Chinese Communist Party. The British allowed a measure of democracy in late colonial Singapore. There was a general election in 1959, and after that, the colony was given internal self-government under a left-wing party called the People's Action Party. It was left-wing, but not communist. It was led by a British-educated lawyer, Lee Kuan Yew. In 1963, the British authorities, who still had control of security in Singapore, mounted something called Operation Cold Store, and that resulted in the detention and effectively the political neutralization of elements within the People's Action Party which were aligned with the communists. And that left Lee Kuan Yew as head of a more or less moderate socialist government which wanted Singapore to become independent, but not independent as a separate state, independent as a component of a larger Malaysian federation. So that would involve joining Singapore with the Malay states and other colonies in the Malayan Peninsula. So there was no ambition at that stage for Singapore to become a separate state. That came later. So Singapore became independent in August 1963. Just 2 weeks later, it entered into a Malaysian federation which joined Singapore with the Malayan Peninsula, which had been independent for several years already, and also, rather unexpectedly at the time, with two large British colonies from the island of Borneo, Sabah, which was previously North Borneo, and Sarawak. So Singapore just became one state within a much larger federation. But it didn't work. Singapore was only inside Malaysia for 2 years. It was very uncomfortable. There were persistent disputes over economic policy, over the political status of Singapore within this larger federation. And a particular problem was that the PAP, under Lee Kuan Yew, was such a forceful political organization that had accrued so much support from ethnic Chinese, not just in Singapore, but also in the rest of Malaysia, that it threatened the political status quo within the federation. In other words, the People's Action Party was effectively threatening to take over the whole Malaysian federation. And that was unacceptable to the ethnic Malay political elites who had effectively inherited Malaysia from the British. So I think to the credit of both the Singaporean leadership and the Malaysian leadership, in early August 1965, Singapore exited from Malaysia. It was evidently a negotiated withdrawal from the Federation, and it resulted in a very unexpected development, that Singapore became a completely sovereign, independent city-state. And this was not what Lee Kuan Yew or the People's Action Party had originally wanted. They'd seen themselves as ultimately controlling the whole of Malaysia, but they ended up controlling a city. Singapore's early years of independence were very difficult. They were characterized by economic fragility and also what I would call existential vulnerability. They were constantly insecure in relation to the Malaysian Federation that they'd just left, and the PAP government had to make really vigorous efforts to enhance the security of their new mini-state, because there were external pressures from Malaysia and also from Indonesia, because for the previous 2 years, Indonesia had been trying to undermine and destroy the Malaysian Federation. The Indonesians were particularly aggravated by the inclusion of the Borneo states, Sabah and Sarawak, inside Malaysia. And also there were domestic ethnic tensions in Singapore, because when Singapore separated from Malaysia in 1965, there was a significant minority of ethnic Malay Muslims left inside Singapore, roughly 1/6 of the population. And that's a proportion which has endured to this day. And there were real doubts over the loyalty of this minority to the new state. And at that time, when Singapore separated from Malaysia, its armed forces were very small. There were 2 locally raised infantry battalions, the Singapore Infantry Regiment, and one of those 2 battalions formed part of the Malaysian forces combating the Indonesian infiltration into Sabah and Sarawak. There were a few wooden patrol vessels, and that was it. So the local military forces only amounted to several hundred personnel. At the same time, the Malaysian armed forces still occupied a number of local military camps. Malaysia had its naval base, in fact, its main naval base in Singapore, and that was to stay in Singapore until 1990, for another 25 years before its exit was negotiated. And there was another problem. Unexpectedly, in 1967 and 1968, the British government made a series of announcements that it would be, as a result of economic pressures at home, a balance of payments crisis, it would be withdrawing its military forces from east of Suez. In other words, from bases in the Arabian Peninsula, places like Bahrain, Kuwait, Aden, of course, and also from its bases in the Far East, which meant, by that stage, mainly Singapore. And that was a big problem for Singapore, because Singapore's own armed forces were minimal, and the British military presence had substantial economic value. About 20% of GDP came from the British military bases and personnel. So that was a major crisis. But the PAP resolved that and a number of other crises over the next half century. So fast forward 55 years to the present day, Singapore has not only survived, but it's prospered to an extent that I think would have been difficult to imagine in the late 1960s, when it was a rather run-down, decayed, post-colonial city. Some of Singapore's early success is due to the institutional and infrastructural foundations that were bequeathed by Britain. But the PAP has provided, over the last half century, very strong political and economic leadership and stability. And it's done that particularly by ensuring the rule of law. And I think that's what makes Singapore stand out in its region. And that emphasis on the rule of law has included very strict anti-corruption measures, which again makes Singapore rather exceptional in its own region. The PAP government of Singapore has, over the decades, also implemented, I think it's fair to say, quite a sophisticated foreign policy, a foreign policy which emphasizes, in broad terms, non-alignment, friendship towards all states, regardless of their ideology. And that has ensured that as many other countries as possible have a stake in Singapore's prosperity and security. It's, the economy of Singapore has evolved to become broadly based, increasingly dominated by the service sector, particularly wholesale trade as a result of the entrepot status, but also financial services over the last 20 or 30 years, and also high-end manufacturing, especially electronics, precision engineering, and biomedical engineering. And the economy of Singapore has shown quite amazing resilience, despite successive regional and global crises, the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis. So resilience, persistent innovation, often motivated by the government, and that's allowed an impressive average growth rate of 7% since 1965. And by 2022, per capita GDP for Singapore was the world's second highest. Singapore's got no natural resources, and it sits astride major shipping routes, so it's not surprising that it depends very heavily on maritime trade, and its entrepot role within Southeast Asia means that the value of its external trade is 3 times the size of its economy. I think that underlines how important trade is to Singapore's survival. If Singapore's trade is significantly interrupted, Singapore's economy will effectively die. So moving on to look at Singapore's maritime security interests, because it's a small state which is so heavily dependent on maritime trade and at the same time hemmed in geographically by larger neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia, Singapore has crucial maritime security concerns. I think you could, to use the terminology sometimes deployed by the People's Republic of China, I think you could say that Singapore's maritime security concerns are literally core interests for the Republic. Kay Shanmugam, who at one time was Singapore's foreign minister, has highlighted the importance of freedom of navigation for Singapore. He said that it's an economically existential issue because foreign trade is so vital to the city-state's existence and sovereignty. Because Singapore's immediate neighbors are so physically close, it's got no exclusive economic zone, and that, in a way, that simplifies its maritime security interests. But it does mean that Singapore is acutely and enduringly concerned over ensuring that it has access to the open seas. So Singapore has tried to protect and promote its maritime interests, above all through diplomacy and by upholding international law. And it's been an active supporter of the UN International Maritime Organization for decades, and it's served continuously on the Council of the IMO since 1993. And at the same time, Singapore has been very active diplomatically on international maritime issues. Some examples are that it's sought assurances from China over freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, which has been the site of intensifying tensions between China and those Southeast Asian states which have territory there or are exploring for oil and gas or are using fishing grounds there. And Singapore has also negotiated an agreement with its neighbor Malaysia, which allowed them to submit their dispute over the tiny island of Pedro Branca, where there's a Singapore-operated lighthouse, to the International Court of Justice. Singapore's use of international law to support its maritime interests was also shown when its diplomat, quite high-profile diplomat Tommy Koh, served as president of the third UN Conference on the Law of the Sea. And in that way, Singapore was able to contribute directly to UNCLOS, which was adopted in 1982. And that role in shaping UNCLOS brought gains to Singapore. Singapore also is highly active in regional cooperation, and the fact that the city-state is non-aligned and pragmatic facilitates that. It's ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which includes 10 of the 11 Southeast Asian countries, has always been seen as vital by Singapore. But at the same time, Singapore does not expect too much from ASEAN. It's realistic about what ASEAN can do. It knows that it's because of the diversity of ASEAN's membership and their different political complexions and in some cases, the nature of their relations with China, which is important in the region for economic reasons, that it's difficult for ASEAN, for example, to take a strong stand against Chinese activities in the South China Sea. And the former Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, said earlier this year that negotiating an ASEAN-China code of conduct in the South China Sea will take some time. Well, that was an understatement. I mean, it's already taken about 20 years, and there's no sign that a code of conduct is likely in anything like the foreseeable future. So, realistic about ASEAN, but at the same time, in a way, devoted to ASEAN, because without ASEAN, I think the Singaporean view is that it would be hard to maintain any sort of regional cooperation in Southeast Asia. Singapore places a great emphasis on the practical dimensions of regional cooperation. It tends to be skeptical about vague statements of good intent. It prefers tangible cooperation, even if that's on a limited scale. And one example would be the Malacca Straits Security Initiative, which has involved joint sea and subsequently also joint air patrols initially with Indonesia and Malaysia, and then also Thailand, aimed primarily against the threat of piracy in the Malacca Strait. And also the Singapore Navy has taken the lead in setting up a regional information fusion center at its Changi Naval Base, which involves countries from the region and also external players, notably the United States. At the same time, naval power is important to Singapore as a means of protecting its maritime security in a regional geopolitical environment which, from Singapore's point of view, is perennially uncomfortable. Singapore's worried by growing tensions between, on the one hand, some ASEAN members, and on the other, China, between China and Taiwan, and between China and the US. At the same time, because of the nature of Singapore's demography, it's 78% ethnic Chinese, its ruling party is dominated by ethnic Chinese. Direct conflict with China is unthinkable. It would be politically untenable for Singapore to be engaged as part of a coalition that went to war with China. That's simply not going to happen. The real maritime threats that concern Singapore at the practical level are much closer to home. And they relate to its still uncomfortable relations with its much larger immediate neighbors, Indonesia and Malaysia. So Singapore is very important to those countries in economic terms, but at the same time, Singapore is resented because of its wealth, because of its links to the West, sometimes because of its links to Israel. And over the decades, there have been sporadic challenges from Malaysia and Indonesia to Singapore. In the past, sometimes those have involved significant military mobilization by one or other of those two countries, occasionally by both Indonesia and Malaysia at the same time, aimed at intimidating Singapore. And so I think there is an enduring fear in Singapore that in the worst case, Malaysia or Indonesia, or even both, might attempt to interfere with its maritime trade. So part of Singapore's naval development is aimed at deterring such interference. On a day-to-day basis, Singapore's maritime security concerns, though, focus on challenges from non-state actors, and this has been the case for the last 20 years or so. The concerns focus, first of all, on concerns over piracy and sea robbery, which have mainly resulted from the activities of criminals based in Indonesia. Since the early 2000s and the start of the global war on terrorism, Singapore's also become highly conscious of the potential threat from internationally sponsored Islamist terrorism, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And that's included concern about the risk of maritime terrorism, which could potentially include attacks on ships passing through the Malacca Strait or the Singapore Strait, or even on Singapore's port infrastructure. And they've taken really strong measures over the last 20 years to deter such attacks with intensified patrols around the island and strong measures, including the designation of certain army units to protect the port infrastructure. What you might call the inner cordon of Singapore's maritime security and defense is provided by the police Coast Guard, which combines the roles of Marine Police and Coast Guard. It provides security for the city-state's territorial waters and the eastern approaches to the island and the area around the Pedro Branca lighthouse. It operates from several bases around Singapore's coast. It's got port, interceptor, and coastal patrol squadrons. There's also a special task squadron for high-risk operations. So the police coast guard is an important, well-funded force. It's probably larger than some small countries' navies, and seems to be highly effective and professional. And another role, of course, is another police coast guard role is the interception of illegal immigrants. Not that there are many, but occasionally people will try to get into Singapore waters from Malaysia or Indonesia. Beyond the inner cordon, Singapore's defense depends on the Singapore Armed Forces, and in the maritime sphere, on the Republic of Singapore Navy, the RSN. In its structure, the Singapore Armed Forces is comparable to the Israel Defense Forces, which provided a model in its early years in the late 60s and early 70s. So the key elements are an army based on conscription and reservists, a largely professional air force, and a small but well-equipped and largely professional army, and also, since a couple of years ago, there's a fourth service, a digital and intelligence service. Initially, the Singapore Armed Forces were dominated by the Army, although the Air Force also had substantial funding. Until the 1980s, the Republic of Singapore Navy was what you might call a Cinderella service. It was not invited to the party, and it was mainly focused, until that time, on pushing refugees from Vietnam back to sea. But there was a wider recognition of the importance of maritime security for Singapore in the early 1980s, and that led to a milestone decision in 1983 to extend the role of the Singapore Navy to protect Singapore's sea lines of communication. And there was an order for a small number of corvettes at that stage, which were referred to at the time, I remember, as 1,000-ton ships. So I think that's an indication of how small the Singapore Navy's vessels were until that time. And then at the end of the 1980s, the Navy 2000 plan saw orders for mine hunters, patrol aircraft, new patrol vessels, landing ships, and very significantly, for the first time, submarines. And then in the year 2000, frigates were ordered. So over time, the size of vessels ordered for the Singapore Navy has expanded and expanded, and that's a process that's going on. So this slide shows the main elements of the RSN's current order of battle, and bear in mind that this is a country with a population of slightly less than 6 million, and you can see four submarines, 6 missile frigates, 8 corvettes, 6 smaller corvettes, 4 8,000-ton landing platforms, and also maritime patrol aircraft and anti-submarine helicopters operated for the Navy by the Air Force. But it doesn't stop there, because there are some really significant plans in train for the continuing enhancement of the Singapore Navy's capabilities, and there are three main programs underway at the moment. The first is to locally build 8 new large destroyer-sized multi-role combat vessels. So it looks like these will be in the 8,000 to 10,000 ton range, built to a joint Swedish-Singapore design for delivery from 2028. And they will be genuine multi-role vessels. Alongside air defense and surface warfare, they'll be able to function as motherships controlling uncrewed platforms, which will, according to the official statement, operate across air, surface, and underwater domains. So they'll operate UAVs, USVs, and UUVs. The second program involves 4 German-built Type 218 submarines, which are now being delivered, and the first of those is due to commission within the next several weeks. And thirdly, it's been reported quite reliably, I think, that there are going to be 4 joint multi-mission ships, which will look like small aircraft carriers, and they'll be able to operate Air Force F-35Bs as well as helicopters, and those are going to replace the LPDs. And it's always Singapore practice to say, this is simply a replacement for vessels that we already operate, but the jump from the present LPDs to these joint multi-mission ships will be a huge step up. I'm talking about 4 ships that operate joint strike fighters is quite a leap. Singapore places great emphasis on naval cooperation, and that includes, interestingly, close naval cooperation with the US. So on the one hand, Singapore is non-aligned. On the other hand, they make it clear that that doesn't rule out very close security cooperation particularly with Western countries. And that security cooperation with the US has incrementally stepped up over the last 50 or 60 years. And it began with Singapore allowing US servicemen from South Vietnam into the city for rest and recreation breaks in the late 1960s, and then it involved naval visits and then aircraft visits and then establishment of a liaison office and so on. So it's very intense cooperation now, and the deep cooperation with the US Navy includes the location in Singapore of a branch of the US Indo-Pacific Command. It's an element called Comlog Westpac, which is logistics facilities for the Western Pacific, which has the code name CTF-73, and it's commanded by an admiral. And there are also facilities at Changi Naval Base, including a destroyer squadron headquarters for US littoral combat ships, which are deployed to Singapore on an occasional basis. And they also have detachments of P-8 maritime patrol aircraft at one of the air bases. So it's there is a US presence there, but Singapore is emphatic that the US does not have a base in Singapore, and the US is very sensitive to that. They play the game. They only talk about facilities, not a base. And Singapore has also participated in US-led coalition operations, despite its non-alignment. It's participated selectively in coalition operations, especially where those relate to freedom of navigation. And, for example, since 2009, the Singapore Navy has repeatedly contributed to CTF 151 in the Gulf of Aden. 5 times it's provided the force commander and supporting staff. And this year, earlier this year, it also contributed HQ personnel to Operation Prosperity Guardian, aimed at countering the Houthi attacks on international shipping. And there's also quite strong cooperation through the 5-power defense arrangements. The 5-power defense arrangements was essentially a legacy of the British and Australian and New Zealand military presence in the region after the Second World War, and it was established at the same time that the British were withdrawing from east of Suez. It was set up in 1971 to maintain British, Australian, and New Zealand security cooperation with Singapore and Malaysia, mainly through exercises. But the UK still has a foothold at the old Royal Navy base in Singapore, and interestingly, has responsibility for military fuel supplies for Singapore and also for Malaysian forces in the southern part of the Malaysian peninsula. And the tempo of British Royal Navy ship visits to Singapore and the surrounding region has increased over the last few years. As the Singapore Navy's ships have become increasingly large and capable, this has allowed participation in more international exercises, sometimes far from home. An obvious example is RIMPAC, the world's largest maritime exercise, and this year, during the RIMPAC exercise near Hawaii, a Singapore frigate test-fired its surface-to-air missiles. And Singapore also joins naval exercises with France, India, Japan, and even China on an annual basis. And that means it has exposure to diverse influences which help to compensate for its lack of operational experience. I think Singapore's overall external security and defense strategy, which has an important maritime dimension, makes good sense in peacetime, but how this non-aligned approach would stand up to the stress of a major regional conflict, a real war in Asia, I think is another question. In normal circumstances, this non-aligned strategy probably helps to manage relations with Indonesia and Malaysia, and if its efforts to accommodate and at the same time deter neighbors fails, Singapore could probably count on at least diplomatic and probably also logistic support from its Western allies. But if there was a major conflict, if tensions between China and the US broke out in open conflict over Taiwan, or in the South China Sea, or in what I think would be a really bad case for Singapore, in the Malacca Strait, then Singapore would face pressure to take sides. Both the Americans and the Chinese would be saying, you really should, you have to make up your mind. Are you with us or are you against us? And I think in those circumstances, it would be really difficult for Singapore to come to a clear decision. They would try, I think they try to avoid making a decision, but circumstances, it's possible to think of circumstances that could force a difficult and uncomfortable decision. So, in conclusion, I think this case study shows how a small, if wealthy state with important maritime interests has used diplomacy, international law, naval power, and security cooperation to develop and protect its maritime interests. Singapore has had a lot of success as a maritime state. It punches above its weight. It does more than you might expect a state of that size to do in the maritime arena. But it's in a difficult geopolitical predicament, and that means it cannot relax. It takes a constant effort, and you can see that in the way that it's constantly trying to enhance its naval capability. And in the worst case, if there was a major regional crisis, essentially one involving China, that would, I think, challenge Singapore's capacity to maintain its non-alignment and to protect its maritime interests. So, thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Huxley. It's been very illustrative. So I think that everybody here knows how it works, and now it's time to deepen more in the knowledge about Singapore, and it's time for Q&A. So who starts?
Yes, hello. Thanks a lot. You mentioned this, that Singapore had some relations with Israel in the military realm. So I thought the new submarines, the Type 218 that they have ordered, they were originally based on an Israeli design, the Dolphin II, perhaps. Can you, maybe not, Paul also knows about this, but can you expand a little bit on these relations between the militaries of Singapore and Israel?
Okay, so the Singapore-Israel relationship is very important to both parties, I think. And it goes back to before Singapore became independent. I think it goes back to the 1950s when there was cooperation on a number of non-military developments, including public housing. And so if you look at some of the early public housing in Singapore, it's built to a sort of Israeli pattern. So there were links between Singapore and Israel even before 1965. When Singapore became independent unexpectedly in 1965, it faced this really dire security predicament. And in those circumstances, they wanted to find a partner which could help them rapidly to build up a defense capability. And in the context of the late 1960s, this was pretty soon after the War of 1967, in which Israel had outstanding success. I think Singapore's leaders realized that they could see commonalities between Israel's geopolitical predicament and their own, in that they were small states, in each case populated by people whose presence in the region, in their own region, was not entirely welcomed by their neighbors, where there were ethnic differences between their own populations and surrounding populations, where they were much smaller states than those surrounding them, But at the same time, they had advantages in terms of educational level and level of development compared to their immediate neighbors. And I think those parallels and the fact that there was already a degree of cooperation with Israel made them attractive as a partner. And so Singapore's leadership invited Israel to help. And they were Singapore was very uncomfortable about it, and because they knew that their immediate neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia, would not welcome an Israeli military presence and would create problems, more problems for Singapore if it became widely known. And so they were initially known as Mexican military advisors. And these Mexican military advisors trained the trainers. So they didn't have direct contact with Singapore conscripts, but they trained the NCOs who would be training the conscripts. And many of I've spoken to some of the early conscripts who said that the training that they got from Israeli-trained NCOs was pretty rigorous. And so that was the start of it. But over time, the relationship has grown and widened. So at the end of the 60s, in the early 70s, Singapore's first armor came from Israel. AMX-13 light tanks and also armored personnel carriers, and then over time a defense industrial relationship has developed, and I think what I understand that is quite wide ranging. In fact, and focuses particularly on adaptation of military equipment. So I think one key area where Israel has a strength is in customizing US equipment for local requirements. So fitting avionics and targeting and so on into F-16s was something that I think Singapore benefited from Israeli experience in that area. And also in defense space. So I think Singapore has had I understand Singapore may have had a role in the development of OFEC surveillance satellites and so on. So it's a wide-ranging relationship, and of course Singapore has to stay quite low-key about that. It's not something that they like to publicize, but it's a reality, and it reflects their geopolitical position and the fact that they still see parallels with Israel's predicament.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I have a question concerning something that you said about the joint multi-mission ships and the possibility that they could be used as sort of light aircraft carriers.
Oh, yes.
Because, I mean, my question is, what could be the rationale, the reason behind this possibility, in the sense that I'm no expert on the matter, but if I'm not wrong, aircraft carriers basically are interesting in terms of power projection.
Yes.
So if Singapore's naval policy is concerned basically with protecting maritime routes and keeping the ceilings free, what could be the use of a light carrier in these terms? Thank you.
Yes. Well, I think the key to this is that these are not quite aircraft carriers, but they would be more like platforms for F-35. So F-35s could operate from them, but they might not have hangars and all the usual support that you'd expect for combat aircraft on an aircraft carrier, because they would be relatively small ships. So they'd be more like launch platforms or seagoing forward operating platforms for F-35s. So this, I think it reflects the fact that Singapore has no strategic depth, and that it has a limited number of air bases, and it has it has 2 or 3 main air bases which take up a lot of space and which are under pressure from urban development. And the 3 current air bases are probably going to be cut back to 2 over the next few years. So they're always looking at how they can operate their air force if the main air bases are knocked out. So there are various ways of doing that, like having multiple runways on the existing bases, buying, in the first instance, F-35Bs, which are the short takeoff and landing version, and also there's been quite a lot of emphasis over the years of operating from highways in an emergency, in a contingency, and they ostentatiously rehearse that from time to time, and there are 1 or 2 very small islands around the coast of Singapore which have what you might call auxiliary landing strips on, and I think the joint mission support ships would fit into that that strategy of trying to ensure that they're not reliant on major air bases. And in operational terms, I can think of various ways that they might be used. I mean, one would be in a limited operation in Singapore's region that might also involve limited land forces like special forces, helicopters, perhaps some sort of one can imagine an evacuation operation or an operation to help a neighbor against a terrorist lodgement. For example, there was the Lahud Datu incident in Sabah about 10 years ago when a group of terrorists from the southern Philippines made a lodgement on the coast of Malaysia, and it took Malaysia about a week to respond. And that one can imagine circumstances where a neighbor might need support from Singapore. So I think the answer is that these ships would increase the flexibility of the Singapore Armed Forces capacity to respond to all sorts of possible contingencies.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Huxley, for this very interesting case study. As you were saying earlier, there have been mounting, pressures on Singapore have been amounting to avoid non-alignment and to take some steps towards adopting a more specific position. And I was wondering, to what extent do you think that the operations that we've been seeing in recent decades, but specifically in recent years, to what extent are those operations to be understood as more genuine, like actions of small steps of alignment towards Western leading, coalitions or countries? Or to what extent do you think that's actually just a response to the growing pressure due to China's growing role and challenge towards multipolarism? Thank you.
Yeah. It's a good question. So I see the main reason for Singapore's intensifying security relations with the West, which means essentially the US, over the last, which started in the late 1960s, so 55 years ago. I think the main reason is to keep America in the region. After the Tet Offensive in 1968, soon after that, 1969, President Nixon announced the so-called Guam Doctrine, in which he essentially said the US is going to pull out of Southeast Asia, and if Southeast Asian countries face security challenges, we will help them indirectly. We will support their armed forces. We might use air power. But what he was saying was no more US ground troops in this region. And so it was like the beginning of an American strategic withdrawal from Southeast Asia. And I think this threw Singapore's leadership into great introspection and concern, because their policy towards the US military role in the region changed quite soon afterwards. And then you saw them say, oh yeah, American troops from Vietnam, sure, come to Singapore for your rest and recreation. Oh yeah, we can provide refueling facilities for American ships and aircraft in the region. Yeah, we don't mind having military exercises with the US. And it's increased over the years. The stronger the signs that the US role in the region isn't going to last forever, the more strongly Singapore has supported the US role in the region. It seems it's closely articulated. And so it's not that Singapore is aligned with the US, it's that they fear what would happen to the region if the US wasn't there. And I think they appreciate pragmatically and realistically that America's role is vital for the regional balance. And particularly as China becomes more powerful and more assertive, the US role is absolutely necessary to make sure that China doesn't dominate the region. And it isn't necessarily that Singapore is uncomfortable per se with China's role. Singapore doesn't, I don't think there's any strong feeling in Singapore that what China is doing in the region is wrong as such. It's more that it could have strongly adverse consequences for Singapore if the region becomes more polarized. And because Singapore is largely ethnic Chinese in its composition, it could become a victim of a more polarized region. So for those reasons, it's very important to, as far as possible, maintain the status quo, maintain stability, and the key to that is keeping America heavily involved in regional security.
I'd like to ask a question about the economical integrity of Singapore in the long run, with the shift, well, the possible shift in naval trade, with the incorporation of green fuels and the inevitable emergence of new bunkering hubs, how this will affect the economic position and the importance of Singapore in the region. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. That's also a good and interesting question. Singapore is always concerned, and I think has reasons for concern, when it looks like there could be a change in the physical pattern of trade in the region. And what you talk about is a challenge. Another challenge is the possibility that is often discussed of a canal across southern Thailand, and that's come up again within the last several years as a possibility. And there have been a number of such, and another one is development of new ports in Malaysia. Or Indonesia. But when it comes to it, the fact that Singapore operates strictly under the rule of law, and that Singapore's everything that happens in Singapore is predictable and reliable, and Singapore operates effectively. It's seen as a safe and reliable option by shipping lanes and by others involved in maritime trade. And when it comes to it, I think they're reluctant to move away from that reliability and predictability. And you get in other regional countries, I wouldn't point at a particular country, but there is an atmosphere in the region of what you might call rent-seeking, and that doesn't apply in Singapore. So, yeah, other options may emerge, but and Singapore can't be complacent, and it's constantly working to improve the ease of transshipment and all. But I think Singapore's role is fairly well assured for those reasons.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Back to the broader view over the region that I'm sure you're very familiar with, considering your expertise on Singapore. Firstly, when Singapore partakes in military exercises, very predominantly with Western powers, Western armies and navies, that's a choice. When they do that, it's not only to gain experience, but also integration, very much integration, in much the same way as Sweden and Finland took part in NATO exercises long before they even envisaged joining. Also, another point would be that they've chosen F-35s over J-20s. I don't know whether J-20s are available as VSTOL or not, but that's a choice also. So clearly they do tend towards Western and liberal Western powers. Now, to the broader regional situation, how serious do you think any outcome could be regarding Taiwan, considering that the Indian Navy from Andaman could blockade Malacca very easily, as well as US ships? Considering that any other route would take them all the way around Australia and back into the Indian Ocean in the south, does that sort of indicate that China is unlikely, for economic reasons, to take action? I know this is not the focus of this conference on Singapore, but it does obviously affect Singapore extraordinarily.
I think Singapore has evidently favored defense cooperation with Western countries over defense cooperation with China, although it has, for the last 15 years or so, it has made what were initially token gestures of military cooperation with China, particularly in the form of exercises and some minor personnel exchanges, I think. But over the last year or two, those have intensified a bit beyond the token. I was quite struck by the fact that as as Singapore has intensified its cooperation with Western countries, it's had to balance that. And I think partly to keep the Chinese happy, it had to do a bit more with the PLA as well. But you're right, the cooperation with Western powers is predominant. I mean, the fact that it depends what you mean by liberal. I mean, in an economic sense, yeah, that's fine for Singapore. But Singapore is not a liberal democracy. So they're not interested in that aspect of Western liberalism. On Taiwan, I don't think the Chinese would be interested in blockading the straits. It wouldn't make any sense. It would be what they're interested in is keeping the straits open, and I think it would be more likely that it would be China's opponents that would try to blockade the straits, and that would be very difficult for Singapore, and it would. And it would put, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure I can quite see India engaging in that. But I mean, it depends how India's interests were being threatened. But I don't see India having a direct interest in in supporting the US over a Taiwan conflict. But certainly anything involving blockade or potential blockade of the Malacca Strait would be of direct and critical interest to Singapore, and it would be, I think, alarming. And for that reason, Singapore is very interested in anything that will damp down the possibility of conflict over Taiwan, or of conflict between the US and China more broadly in East Asia.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Huxley, for your presentation. I would like to know, you explained that the importance of the ethnic configuration of Singapore in the history and nowadays, but how they manage the ethnic minorities on their armed forces. Yes.
Thanks. So Singapore's ethnic balance, domestic ethnic balance, is a matter of extreme interest to the government, and I think it's been important from Singapore's early years that the ethnic makeup of the country remains more or less the same, and there are challenges there because in aggregate, it's emerged with that different ethnic groups in Singapore have differential birth rates, and so some ethnic groups' share of the population would naturally increase over time. And so to balance that, Singapore's used immigration. And there's been a massive program of immigration of ethnic Chinese people from mainland China, but also from Malaysia and Taiwan, but particularly from mainland China. And so that's helped to maintain the ethnic balance within the population. But there's been significant political blowback from that, and Singaporeans who might initially have welcomed that or have been indifferent to it, at the grassroots level, there's been a really significant negative reaction, and it relates to particularly to employment and a sense, which may or may not be based on reality, that immigrants are taking blue-collar jobs from ordinary Singaporeans, and that's had negative political consequences, which the PAP has had to manage, and has managed fairly well. Within the armed forces, there's been a sensitivity attached to ethnicity from the very beginning. Over time, that's changed, and Singapore's government now points and has pointed for a number of years to success stories of Malays within the armed forces. There have been one or two brigadier generals of Malay ethnicity, and it's refuted the idea that there's prejudice against them in the armed forces. And I think that's the truth, that the situation has improved over time. But in the early years, it was a big and sensitive issue.
So, if there are no more questions, well, last one.
Yeah, it's just related to what you said, that you have just before described how Singapore tries to maintain a balance in a multicultural society, but China, especially in the last years, has they have begun to see all the overseas Chinese, so everyone who is an ethnic Chinese but who lives outside mainland China, as part of but not their country, but they have an interest in these populations.
Yes.
In the so-called United Front
yes.
influence
Yeah.
operations of trying to
Yes.
cooptate. And I don't know how Singapore has tried to, has reacted to that, because I think it goes completely against this balance they try to maintain.
Yes. The Singapore government has been very aware of that, and there have been one or two instances that have shown resistance to China trying to exploit the loyalty of Singapore Chinese. Singapore government has makes it clear that sort of interference. Singapore is very conscious of that danger. And another example of Singapore's position on this is that when there are official meetings between Singapore politicians and Chinese politicians, or Singapore public servants and People's Republic of China civil servants, or Singapore Armed Forces officers and People's Liberation Army officers, the Singapore side will only speak English. Yeah, only English, no Chinese. Yeah, because the fear is that if Chinese is used, then the Chinese side will try to assert the idea that we're all Chinese together. Surely you understand our position. Singapore, no, English only.
Okay, that's quite a keen move.